evening by the Departments of History and American Studies. I'm Les Robinson, a PhD candidate in the Department of History and a co-president of Brown War Watch. For those unfamiliar with our group, Brown War Watch is the anti-war and peace activist group on the Brown campus. For those eager to hear more about our work, you can reach out directly to us on our email, brownwarwatch@brown.edu, on Twitter, on Facebook, and our website, brownwarwatch.com. This semester, we're meeting at 7 p.m. on Tuesday nights and welcome all political persuasions and religious beliefs, united by the quest to build a more peaceful world, dismantle the profligate war machine, and raise awareness about conflicts around the world and rising tensions between the world's superpowers. This semester, we're focusing particularly on the intersection of militarism and other injustices, whether racial, economic, or climate, amongst others. Tonight, we dedicate this film screening to Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, Daniel Prude, George Floyd, Natashiana Jefferson, Aura Rossa, Stephen Clark, Botham Jean, Philando Castile, Alton Sterling, Michelle Cusseau, Freddie Gray, Janelle Fonville, Eric Garner, Akai Gurley, Gabriana Nevarez, Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, Tanisha Anderson, and the too many Black Americans killed by racist state violence here at home. We also dedicate the film to the victims across the world of America's endless wars since 9/11, the 800,000 people who have died due to a direct war violence, the 335,000 civilians who have been killed as a result of the fighting, and the 37 million refugees and displaced persons. Tonight, we are proudly showcasing a newly restored digital copy of the 1968 film, only very recently acquired by Brown Library for this screening. This restored version is available because of the hard work of committed film archivists and specialists through a collaboration between Anthology Film Archives and the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. We are grateful for those people and in their critical preservation work of an important historical document. Sadly, the pandemic has limited our ability to access a hard copy, so we are streaming the film tonight through Zoom, which, if we're being honest, is not absolutely ideal. So we thank you in advance for your patience and understanding and persistence if the film occasionally falls out of sync. But we think the film is worth it. But it will ask a great deal of your internet connection. We've found that the quality of the screening improves within moments though, so stay with it. But if you're having major troubles with the screening, members of the Brown community should know that you can stream it directly from the Brown Library. Just search for the film title or find the link in the chat. We'll post it. Friends joining us from the wider community, welcome. You can find the film, sadly the unrestored version, on YouTube. We'll also post that link in the chat. Preferably you'll stay here with us, and most certainly we hope you'll here with us for the discussion, which will begin promptly after the 68-minute film ends. We know it's going to be a good one. During the film, if you have questions about the film itself or the history that runs through it, we encourage you to please make use of the chat function and post your questions there. Only the host can see your questions, so every and all questions are welcome. Don't be afraid. We look forward to getting to as many of them as we can after the screening. Okay, to the movie itself. David Loeb Weiss's 1968 documentary film follows the Harlem leg of the April 15, 1967 New York City march that itself formed a key part of marches organized by the Spring Mobilization Committee to end the war in Vietnam. That day represents a culmination of one of the greatest grassroots efforts of peace and anti-war activism in the nation's history. a day when people took to the streets in never before seen numbers in an effort to put an end to a racist and imperialist war, like the endless racist and imperial wars that continue today. Over 500,000 people mobilized in New York City and marched towards the United Nations building, where luminaries of peace and justice, including the Reverend MLK Jr., delivered speeches. The march from Harlem, which the film focuses on, was led by, among others, Kwame Ture, a storied Black Power and SNCC leader, whom you will see in the film. The film also highlights the critical role of Black women as consensus builders and opinion shapers within their community. Similar anti-war events of enormous proportions filled cities and towns across the country. The film also prominently features interviews with 3 Black Vietnam War veterans recently returned with the war. That should suffice for background. We're eager to let the film speak for itself, and especially to save discussion for after the screening. On that note, we are honoured and excited to be joined by Associate Professor of History and Africana Studies, Professor Françoise Hamlin, with whom we'll be discussing the film and the currents of history that run through it. We hope we might generate a discussion that allows us to reflect on our own moment of endless racist, white supremacist and imperialist wars. And we hope you'll join us after the screening for that. Okay, without further ado, please enjoy the film, and we look forward to seeing you in a little over an hour. Hello, welcome back. Takes a minute to get yourself together after that final soliloquy by Lorenz, so you bear with for a minute. Okay, so tonight, Brown Wall Watch, let me bring this up on the screen, one moment. Okay. So tonight, Brown Wall Watch is honoured to be joined by Associate Professor Françoise Hamlin. The professor is a faculty member of the History and Africana Studies departments and teaches undergraduate and graduate courses primarily in 20th century US history, African American history, Southern history, cultural studies, and Africana studies. Professor Hamlin is the author of Crossroads at Clarksdale, The Black Freedom Struggle in the Mississippi Delta After World War II, which won the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians First Book Prize and the Lillian Smith Book Award. In Crossroads, Professor Hamlin studies the civil rights movement in Mississippi from 1951 to the present, reinstating women's roles as paramount to the successful maneuverings at the local level and recasting their own understanding of those roles in their own terms. She co-edited with A. Yemisi Jimo, These Truly Are the Brave, an anthology of African-American writings on war and citizenship, which was a finalist for the QBR Book Prize. She has contributed book chapters and book introductions on civil rights worker Vera Mae Piggy, local activism, and Mississippi's long hot freedom summer. She is published widely in leading peer-reviewed journals, including the American Historical Review, the Black Scholar, and the Journal of American History. Professor Hamlin has served as Charles Warren Center Fellow at Harvard and a Woodrow Wilson National Fellow out of Princeton, and in the Frederick Burkhardt Residential Fellowship through the American Council of Learned Societies. Among many awards and honors she's received here at Brown, she's been recognized for excellence in teaching and guidance, something that I can resoundingly confirm. The professor's current research includes work on children and youth during the mass civil rights movement, which seeks to deepen our understanding of lived complexities of activism. Many in our audience will sympathise. Thank you for joining us, Professor Hamlin.
Thank you for having me. This is an honor to be asked. It feels weird doing everything remotely. I've been in this room all day, but it's such a great documentary. It's such a great piece of film that it's nice that it's getting some airtime now and that we can discuss it.
Thank you. We couldn't be obviously more excited and honored that you're joining with us. And obviously this is a piece of history and you're a historian by discipline. But given the gravity of our own moment, we welcome any historical connections you might draw out for our audience, especially as they pertain to our current moment in the white supremacist war machine. So if you feel like I do, and I'm sure you will, it feels like you could unpack every minute of this film and every person that they interview. There's so many rich moments, but perhaps we might begin with just a very broad question. So your general thoughts on the documentary, what you think of its value as a historic document, and the sort of broad and historical narratives that reveal themselves in the film to you.
I thank you. No, I think you're right. There's so much richness there that is actually what stood out for me, right? It shows sort of a multiplicity of opinions amongst within the Black community. If we just focus on the Black community in Harlem and the random people they were interviewing, there's such a wide range of opinions. From pride in military participation to this, questioning notions of patriotism and citizenship and belonging. These are folks on the streets doing this work and having these conversations. What do we have to be patriotic for, right? Sort of having these in-depth questions for the reporter that's based on more than just emotion, right? I'm just sort of very taken back by the level of political consciousness of the everyday people. And that these street level discussions shows that immediately, how sort of, these poor folks have a real understanding of their political reality, a real understanding of the power dynamics of systemic racism. This is 50 years ago, right? And they get it. They get it immediately. They've lived through World War II. Many of the women, particularly, who were interviewed, and between that is the Korean War, and there's a legacy of military participation in the Black community, particularly in Harlem, but sort of in the US anyway, right? This is not the first war with Black military participation. So that for me was sort of the very stark reality and sort of takeaway from this video. It shows that Black folks aren't thinking the same thing, right? That there's a very diverse set of opinions, but also a real sharp political consciousness at the street level, which is really great to see.
Yeah, this is the challenge that historians often have to grapple with when dealing with Black military history. This enormous tension between the military, because of the economic system that pushes them through and it provides a vehicle for upward mobility, yet at the same time, as often as pawns in imperial. And the quick realization in the serving of their role in oppressing other people of color on a global level, and B, that the realities of the institution of the military are extraordinarily racist, that their ambitions are often thwarted. This is really one of the key tensions.
Right, absolutely. And I think from the three veterans, the sort of what I saw was, you know, and I'm doing work on trauma and pain and sort of suffering anyway, but I do see this deep sense of hurt and betrayal, right? There's definitely anger at what's happening and sort of this sort of willingness to fight, um, you know, to fight white supremacy at home, but this deep sense of hurt and betrayal that their service has amounted to nothing, that even with all their training, and then there's this expectation that they stay, you know, they keep waving the flag, um, and sort of that tension and realization for the veterans is profound, and it's very clear on the faces of these men. And this march, and that footage is taken a year after the march as well. So with all that happens in that year, that sort of calendar year, there's a lot going on in the US, right? The 1960s, you know, I teach a class in the 1960s, there's a lot going on. But on the streets, there's a lot going on in the 60s. And so they're responding to all of that and trying to come to terms with how, what that means and what their sacrifices meant. I think that, you know, ending the documentary with that last line, right? That last line, I wrote it down. It's like, you're sick. How can you tell me it's too much to ask to be a human being? I mean, you know, we're talking about Black Lives Matter now. If that isn't Black Lives Matter, you know, if that isn't exactly what Black Lives Matter is about, it's a very, like you said, a very sobering way to end the film, and then with complete silence afterwards, right? So it really sinks in. It's profound and it's brilliant. It's a really brilliant way to end. I'm kind of impressed with that.
Yeah, I agree that the trauma in the interview is one of the reals in that interview, especially with those Black veterans, is just so apparent. And, you know, you can feel they're finally getting to express themselves and what they really feel, but it consumes enormous amounts of energy, and especially the young and charismatic Lorenz, who, like you say, I can't watch that final soliloquy and not just be overcome by the tragedy of it. So perhaps we should stay on the interviews itself, because really the film splits, you know, into, as you say, there's a gap, and there's the street, the protest element, and then there's the interview, and of course, as you say, there's a year that separates it, and much happens, including the assassination of MLK. So you've pointed to Lorenz's sort of final remarks, but were there any other sort of points in the interview portion that really stood out to you as a sort of
I don't know who it was, and that's kind of sort of my criticism as a sort of, you know, as an educator, is like, I want to know who's talking at any particular point, like, who am I talking to? So, you know, that aside, there's a point in, and I got to see this before this, thank God, because I couldn't write fast enough if that wasn't the case. But about 26 minutes in, during the interview, in that interview room, so in May 68, an older gentleman says something about you know, Vietnam, sort of kind of sets up these two scenarios of what's going on, right? Sort of Vietnam is this racist war fought by Black youth, the cream of the crop, right? And sort of that sort of thread of the Black elite going to war, which deprives the community back home of the best of Black intelligence to fight white supremacy. So it's you know, it's kind of setting up this idea of genocide and sort of the brain drain and sort of this cyclical way of abusing the Black community as a whole, starting with that's what happens with homemade setup, starting with you know, starting with the war itself and sort of this brain drain and this idea of because of segregation in higher education, the draft deferral allows more white elites to not go to war. but you know, smart Black men are going to war. And it was also used, the draft was used to co-opt Black men who were part of the civil rights movement. So a lot of that cohort of activists were forced to go in order to, you know, as the state way to pull them out of activism at home. So that sort of, and it was a very sort of, almost a throwaway comment made by this gentleman, and then we kept going. I was like, wait, that's the entire film, right? That's exactly what's going on. And then sort of how that affects the entire community, not only in the present, but those ramifications continue, right? I mean, it has a profound effect on who are the leaders after this, when so many of them are war veterans with wounds, either sort of physical or psychological wounds that come from warfare. So that was something that really stood out for me, and sort of connected sort of the civil rights and sort of what's going on in the 60s with this sort of state enforced draft that comes in, which is very different. That's what makes the Vietnam War very different from the others, from the ones that have come previously, is the enactment of the draft. It sounds like the 3 men were not draftees, but it's not very clear, because at least 2 of them got very well trained. So they were off the infantry until they, you know, one of them opened their mouth and was put back on infantry, right? But to get that level of training as well, probably means that they might not have been draftees, but still, sort of the expectation is that things would be better, right? That they would get training and be able to come home and use those skills, and then not being able to find work in their skill set is not sort of a hero's welcome, right? That's not how you treat veterans. And sort of that sort of lack of recognition. It's not how the World War II vets were treated, right? They got the GI Bill. There's no GI Bill after Vietnam, or during Vietnam, because this is still during the war, right? And so that sort of understanding, and you know, that's what, a 20-year space. So it's still within lifetimes that people don't realize that, you know, this war's not being played out the same way, and the people in uniform don't look the same, so there must be some connection.
Yeah, the gentleman you point to with that sort of cream of the crop line is the director of the Harlem Unemployment Center that they're actually being interviewed in. And this, I think, points to sort of one of the greatest symbolisms of the movie, that they're there in an unemployment center, and the sort of the economic and social purposeful economic and social degradation of the community sort of unfolding, and nothing given to them. Dalton James, the airman, I think who was sent to the jungle because he opened his mouth. I think, you know, oftentimes people say, what's structural racism? What's structural racism? And get intimidated by the theorization of it or whatever. But he describes perfectly as structural racism. Poor investments in high schools, a test to get into the military, funneled into the fighting infantry divisions, and experiencing greater rates of death and coming home just completely damaged by the war. I mean, that is structural racism, and it continues today through the military with the setting up of recruiters in poor neighborhoods. That one passage out of poverty being the military again, and then the same story echoes again, I think, with the lack of wholehearted treatment. The plethora of veterans who make up the opium epidemics or whatever the case may be. So
right, so many of the homeless are veterans, and still, and the sort of the older veterans now are the Vietnam vets, right? But now even the wars in the the wars since 9/11 are now producing a lot of the homeless population, as well as a whole slew of different kind of injuries as well that go far beyond what we can see. Yeah.
So I think one of the things you alluded to with the veterans, and you see it build in a crescendo. I mean, this is one of the humble film, but a genius in so many ways. This sort of crescendo building throughout these experiences where you see the sort of dawning of the racist realities and the connection with the humanity of the Vietnamese, or the refusal of service, even in the army uniform, and also pointing to these events, whether it be the Freedom Summer murders or the 16th Street church bombings that killed four young girls. And the crescendo builds into this sort of warning of violence, and we're not going to take it. How did sort of might get you to speak to this moment and the role of this tension between non-violence with the MLK speech the year earlier and that peaceful march, and this sort of role of Black veterans as change makers, whether it be World War I, World War II, because of that, we're not going to take it anymore.
Yeah, and I do think that's when the year lag makes a difference, right? Because so Martin Luther King gives his speech in April 67, 4th of April 67. It's exactly a year to the day of when he's assassinated in 68. And what I found really interesting, just as an aside, that they didn't really treat that speech very well in the documentary, right? They asked white folks what they thought. And they were dismissive of it. And I was like, okay, well, but that seemed like a missed opportunity there to kind of really dig into what King was trying to do. And again, King was probably at that march as well. I think they said he was. And, the gift of hindsight, we know what happened a year later, but there's that. And also they mentioned the Kerner Commission. I don't know if they used the word, they said the riot report, but it's actually the Kerner Commission, which was appointed by LBJ to kind of figure out, why did these riots happen in 1967? Black folks are like, yeah, okay, we can tell you why this happened. But, and this commission actually comes and says explicitly that the nation is divided, Black and white, and it's structurally unequal. And this is a government level study that comes out and says this. And it's published. It has this it gives profound confidence to folks who've been saying this for a long time, right? And it backs up what King has been saying, but also that anger that comes with it too, because basically Johnson doesn't do anything. He shelves it because, there's an election coming up. This war is way too expensive and there's no money to fix anything. And that wasn't the answer he wanted to hear, right? Because it doesn't talk about sort of, this is a Black problem and we need to solve that. It's like, no, this is a structural problem and, you need to solve that, right? And so that's happening. So that's building that anger and sort of this idea of lack of resources, this inequality, like we're fighting, but for what? And then there's a mention of Columbia. So, there's marches happening in Harlem. The Columbia protests are happening, the anti-war movement's happening there, but they also had their own civil rights and sort of Black rights, Black studies movements are happening at the same time, right? These schools are trying to, are sort of thinking about and having these sort of discussions and protests about Black studies in higher education. But in Harlem, with the town gown issue, right, with Columbia being in Harlem, that's all happening as well. And I'm sure that those young men are fully aware of what's going on, and they are, because they mentioned it. Again, this is when I'm like, could we have a footnote here? Even the title of the film is Muhammad Ali, who's not mentioned at all, right? But the title of the film is is a quote from Muhammad Ali. So there's a lot going on. I'm trying to think what else is going on right now. Stokely Carmichael is there. If you don't recognize him, then you'd miss him, right? If you don't know who he is, you'd miss him. And then by the 4th of April, 68, Martin Luther King is shot and killed. And so this is happening. And then this interview is done less than a month later. So there's a lot of anger. The actual, assassination sort of prompts a lot of protest on the street as well. So it just kind of compounds whatever frustrations that were already there, with more frustrations, and understanding that, and sort of the realization that things are not going to get any better. So we have to take it upon ourselves. We have these skills. It's our duty to do this because we have, we have the sort of the way to do it, and it has to fall on us, because all our leaders are being killed, and that's, I think, is when it's important then to think about all of those things that had happened. And I'm just, touching on the greatest hits, right? The top 5 of what was going on. And we still have to be, mindful that the mass movement for civil rights is still happening, right? It doesn't end when King dies, but there's a lot going on throughout the country at local levels with folks on the streets fighting for equal rights. So the anti-war movement is at the same time. It's at the same time as what's going on with the civil rights movement as well, which is also shifting, right? So, the Black Panthers are in Oakland in '66. So there are different groups, bigger groups, and there's just a lot happening, sort of politically and on the streets, in different parts of the country, alongside independence movements, right, globally. I mean, there's a lot going on. It's not just Vietnam. And I think that one of the vets mentioned, they're reading Mao, they're reading Fanon, they're reading this stuff, right? So they're educating themselves, and sort of, again, those sort of revolutionary ideas that come with that, I think comes across in their interviews as well. It just seems a very throwaway. I heard it and I rewound it and I was like, wait, did they just say Fanon? Yeah. And these are exactly what civil rights activists were reading as well. So again, I'm just impressed to see, right, and to have documented the level of political consciousness on the streets, and with the veterans as well, who are educating themselves on what's going on.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've actually got a great question that will provide a good, from the audience, will provide a good segue to the other part. But one last point I think that I can't not mention was Preston Blake Jr., who was the mechanic with the dark glasses, who has this knowledge of how much the jet costs, and and how many schools it can buy. That moral case that is being made again, like by people like the Poor People's Campaign, Reverend Barber, and this idea of like where all of this money is going to on the military machine, and here at Brown Cost of War program. But I have a great, and we might move across to the sort of the March point. I have a great question, and it ties in with something that I was going to ask you about. And the idea, the scene that the audience members was particularly drawn to was that sort of the almost joins the conversation in the middle, and there seems to be sort of a socioeconomic difference between the two of them, and they're sort of arguing, but then there's this growing sense of solidarity and aligned values between the two, as our audience member says. So I don't have a specific question, but it was one of the few moments one of the key moments in the documentary where really a woman's viewpoint was really featured. I would argue there's a richness of women's viewpoints actually in the film. So the audience member says, I'm curious about what you think about this scene, and maybe I would add on what you think about this ability to sort of convey women's perspectives in this, and what it meant to you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, having done this for a while, it doesn't surprise me that there are a lot of women's voices, because they've always been the ones in the marches. They still are, right? So it's like, yeah, of course, if you're going to be on the streets with the mic, you're going to talk to the women because they're there. And the idea of women sort of acting as their roles as mothers, right? Sort of that being their principal motivation is like, I have sons, they're not going. This has to end, So there's this sort of, communal and social idea of, you know, the war is wrong, but also, no, these are my babies, they're not going. So in that sense, that doesn't feel revolutionary or of any, you know, any kind, because, you know, the mass movement for civil rights, women are on the streets, young people are on the streets, that's the work that they do. And, you know, with so many at war, the women are the ones who are left as well. So in that sense, you know, there's that I feel like it's something to mention, but that's the tenor of how things tend to play out then and now. But also I think with yes, that moment of when the two women looked like they were fighting each other, but then they realized actually we're saying the same thing, which is kind of funny. But it was kind of interesting to see that too, how the one woman who was clearly had more income and more opportunity was a little more hesitant to start with, until it became about, you know, no, of course they should defend themselves, right? And then, you know, the other woman was like, yeah, that's what I've been saying, kind of thing. And sort of, and then that the filmmaker actually, the person interviewing actually just let it play out as well, as opposed to sort of the more sort of modern way of always stepping in with questions and follow-ups and not letting people actually talk, and just actually listening to the stream of consciousness, right? Because that's what you produce, that magic that you couldn't set that up at all if you tried.
So, I might ask one more. We've got one more question, comment, or interpretation. Asking for an interpretation here, and then we might wrap it up after that, so people can go and enjoy their evening. But so the question is, I'm curious about Professor Hamlin's interpretation of the nationalisms in the films, the Black nationalism and the white nationalisms, because they seem to have different interpretations, but both worth a critique. So how do you see the nationalisms emerging?
Yeah, I saw, so there's that little part where they interview clearly Nation of Islam, even though they don't identify it, but they talk about Elijah Muhammad, right? One of the men talks about Elijah Muhammad. It's like, oh, and the government's, you know, we follow the government, we're doing what they say, but we're actually doing our own thing because what we're doing is better and we're better, right? So that 5%, that's all Nation of Islam. And that sort of idea of Black nationalism and Black separatism is that, you know, is about Black determination, right? Which is very different from the white nationalism, which is like, go back to Africa, literally. And sort of the supremacy of, you know, white supremacy, right? In sort of very, very stark ways. But what was interesting with that young man is that, you know, you could talk him down, right? Because he did say, well, actually, we're not trying to kill him. We're doing this for publicity, but, you know, ultimately we believe in the separation of the races, but we actually do see what these Black folks are talking about. Like, they don't have any jobs. Our solution would be to do this instead. You know, is to send them back and let them be, you know, whatever he said it was, which is ridiculous. But, you know, so that it's nationalism, but different kinds of nationalism. And then he said something about communism being a mental disease, but fascism isn't. And I'm like, okay, I don't agree with that. Especially not now, right? Not today, you know, not in this current political moment. But so again, it's, you know, politics as usual, but a sense of there's less political consciousness, right? Even and earlier there was a lone white young man with a tiny little flag saying, you should support that. And he was angry, but not very coherent, right? Just sort of, no, you have to be a patriot. This is terrible. Doesn't have the same level of articulation or sort of literally, you know, sort of handle of the language to really explain what he means. It's very emotional. But again, like I said, this sort of the street level Black consciousness, they explained it. It was clear. They understood it. They thought about it. and were able to articulate it way, way better than probably I'm even doing it right now. It was quite noticeable. So I'd be interested to see what the outtakes look like, right? So what did they cut out? You know, was that purposeful? But it was clear.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean that emotionalism. I mean that is echoing today. A lot of what's driving this white nationalism that we're living with and enduring today is emotive. And you point to that little flag waver, the way that the filmmakers cut him into there. The moment after the black shopkeeper had described a quarter of the country that couldn't vote, and people can't go into bathrooms in the South. It sort of made hollow those fighting for freedom words when we just heard what the freedom encompasses. Well, we should. Did you have any more concluding thoughts or any other sort of ideas that we perhaps didn't give you an opportunity to share?
Well, I mean, we can keep going on forever, right? You and I could talk about this forever. But I'm just always, you know, we always talk about the Double V campaign as a World War II thing, but you're seeing it here, right? So victory at home, victory abroad. Only sort of this hollow victory abroad doesn't mean the same thing as it did during World War II, but that actually the Double V campaign happens in World War One. This is the century-long campaign for civil rights at home with military participation and the equality of military participation, you know, and this fighting for democracy. So for Black patriotism means Double V, right? We're going to do this abroad, but it has to happen here too. It has to be a double. And by Vietnam, it's clear that is not going to happen. Hence sort of this sort of what we see with these vets, with that deep hurt and anger. That's all I wanted to say.
Well, thank you, Professor Hamlin. We can't thank you enough for joining us tonight and speaking to this film. And thank you to all our audience tonight. We're just so excited that you could join us. If you would like to keep in touch with us, again, follow us, send us an email, brownwarwatch@brown.edu. Check out our website or follow us on Twitter or Facebook. You know, mentioning that Double V, we firmly believe that you know, racial justice and peace can walk hand in hand, and they need to be fought together. Okay, well, we wish you all a wonderful evening, and thank you again for joining us. And we wish you a successful, a safe, and healthy semester ahead. So thank you to everybody.
Thank you, everyone.